Page 257. This unanimous, quiet defiance of a power which never forgave, this obstinate, painfully protracted insubordination was somehow more frightening than running and yelling as the bullets fly. In the end, they stopped coaxing us and locked up the huts. In the days that followed, no one left the huts except the orderlies to carry the latrine buckets out and bring drinking water. And coal in. Only bed cases in the medical section were by general agreement allowed not to fast. Only doctors and medical orderlies were allowed to work. The kitchens cooked one meal and poured it away, cooked another, poured that away, and cooked no more. The trustees who worked there seemed to have appeared before the camp authorities on the first day, explained that they simply couldn't carry on and left the kitchens. The bosses could no longer see us, no longer peer into our souls, a gulf that had opened between the overseers and the slaves. None of those who took part will ever forget those 3 days in our lives. We could not see our comrades in other huts, nor the corpses lying there unburied. Nonetheless, the bonds which united us at opposite ends of the deserted camp were of steel. This was a hunger strike called not by well-fed people with reserves of subcutaneous fat, but by gaunt, emaciated men who had felt the whip of hunger daily for years on end, who had achieved with difficulty some sort of physical equilibrium, and who suffered acute distress if they were deprived of a single 100-gram ration. Even the goners starved with the rest, although the 3-day fast might tip them into an irreversible and fatal decline. The food which we had refused, and which we had always thought so beggarly, was a mirage of plenty in the feverish dreams of famished men. This was a hunger strike called by men schooled for decades in the law of the jungle. You die first and I'll die later. Now they were reborn. They struggled out of their stinking swamp. They consented to die today, all of them together, rather than to go on living the same way tomorrow. In the huts, roommates began to treat each other with a sort of ceremonious affection. Whatever scraps of food anyone, this meant mainly those who received parcels, had left were pooled, placed on a piece of rag, spread out like a tablecloth, and then, by joint decision of the whole room, some eatables were shared out and others were put aside for the next day. Recipients of parcels might also have quite a bit of food in the personal provisions store, but for one thing, no one could cross the camp to fetch it, and for another, not everyone would have been happy to bring his leftovers back with him. He might be counting on them to build him up when the strike was over. For this reason, the strike, like everything that happened in prison, was an unequal ordeal, and the truly brave were those who had nothing in reserve, no hope of returning their strength after the strike. If there was any meal, they boiled it at the mouth of the stove and distributed the gruel by the spoonful. To make the fire hotter, they broke planks off the bunks. The couch provided by the state is gone. But who cares when his life may not last the night? What the bosses would not do, one could not predict. What the bosses would do, one could not predict. We thought that perhaps they would start firing on the huts again from the towers. The last thing we expected was any concession. We had never in our lives wrested anything from them, and our strike had the bitter tang of hopelessness. But there was a sort of satisfaction in this feeling of hopelessness. We had taken a desperate step. It could only end badly, and that was good. Our bellies were empty, our hearts were in our boots, but some higher need was being satiated. During those long days, evenings, nights, 3,000 men brooded over their 3,000 sentences, their families, their lack of families, all that had befallen and would yet befall them. And although the hearts in thousands of breaths could not beat together, and there were those who felt only regret, only despair, yet most of them kept time. Things are as they should be. We'll keep it up to spite you. Things are bad. So much the better. This too is a phenomenon which had never been adequately studied. We do not know the law that governs sudden surges of mass emotion in defiance of all reason. I felt this soaring emotion myself. I had only one more year of my sentence to serve. I might have been expected to feel nothing but dismay and vexation that I was dirtying my hands on a broil from which I should hardly escape without a new sentence. And yet I had no regrets. Damn and blast the lot of you. I'll serve my time all over, if you like. All over again. Next day, we saw from our windows a group of officers making their way from hut to hut. A detail of warders opened the door, went along the corridors, looked in the rooms, and called us, not in the old way, as though we were cattle, but gently. Foreman, you're wanted at the entrance. A debate began among us. It was the teams, not their foreman, who had to decide. Men went from room to room to talk it over. Our position was ambiguous. Stoolies had been weeded out from our ranks, but we suspected that there were others, and that there were certainly some, like the slippery, bold-faced foreman mechanic. Mikhail Generalov. And anyway, knowledge of human nature told us that many of those on strike and starving for freedom's sake today would spill the beans tomorrow for the sake of a quiet life in chains. For this reason, those who were steering the strike, and there were leaders, of course, do not show themselves, but remain underground. They do not openly assume power, and the foreman had to openly resign their authority, so that the strikers seemed to be drifting without a helmsman. A decision was reached at last in some invisible quarter. We foremen, 6 or 7 of us, went out to the entrance, where the officers were patiently awaiting us. It was the entranceway of that very same hut, number 2, until recently a disciplinary barracks, from which the metro tunnel had run. And the escape hatch itself was a few meters away from the place where we now met. We leaned back against the walls, lowered our eyes, and stood like men of stone. We lowered our eyes because not one of us could now look at our bosses sycophantedly, and rebellious looks would have been foolish. We stood like hardened hooligans, called before a teachers' meeting, hunched, hands in pockets, heads lowered and averted, incorrigible, impenetrable, hopeless. From both corridors, however, a crowd of sects pressed into the entranceway, and hiding behind those in the front, the back rows could speak freely, call out our demands and our answers. Officially, the officers, with blue-edged epaulets, some we knew, others we had never seen before, saw and addressed only the foreman. The manner was restrained. They did not try to intimidate us, but their tone was still intended to remind us that we were inferior. It would, so they said, be in our own interests to end the strike and the hunger strike. If we did, we would receive not only today's rations, but something unheard of in Gulag, yesterday's too. They were so used to the idea that hungry men can always be bought. Nothing was said either about punishment or about our demands. They might not have existed. The warders stood at the sides, keeping their right hands in their pockets. There were shouts from the corridor. Whoever's to blame for the shooting must be brought to justice. Take the locks off the doors, off with the numbers. The other huts, they also demanded a review of special board cases in the open courts. While we foremen stood like schoolboy hooligans, waiting for the headmaster to finish nagging, the bosses left and the hut was locked up again. Although hunger had begun to get many of us down, our heads were heavy and our thoughts lacking clarity. In our hut, not a single voice was raised in favor of surrender. Any regrets remained unspoken. We tried to guess how high the news of our rebellion would go. They already knew, of course, in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or would learn today. But did Whiskers? That butcher wouldn't stop shooting the lot of us, all 5,000. Toward evening, we heard the drone of a plane somewhere near. Although it was cloudy and not good flying weather, we surmised that someone even higher up had flown in. A seasoned son of Gulag, Nikolai Klibunov, who was friendly with some of us, had landed a job somewhere in the kitchen after 19 years in prison. And he had passed through the camp that day. He was quick enough and brave enough to slip us a half-pooed sack of millet flour through the window. It was shared out between the 17th and cooked at night so the warders couldn't catch us at it. Klibunov passed on some very bad news. Camp Division No. 2, where the Ukrainians were, beyond the Chinese wall, had not supported us. That day and the day before, the Ukrainians had turned out to work as though things were quite normal. There could be no doubt that they had received our notes. They could hear how quiet we had been for 2 days. They could see from the lower crane on the building site that our camp area had been deserted since the shooting. They must have missed meeting our columns outside the camp. Nevertheless, they had not supported us. We learned afterward that the young men who were their leaders and who still had no experience of practical politics had argued that the Ukrainians had their own destiny distinct from that of the Muscovites. They who had begun with such spirit had now fallen back and abandoned us, so that there were not 5,000 of us, but only 3. For the second night, the third morning, and the third day, hunger clawed at our guts. But when on the third morning the Chechists in still greater force again summoned the foreman to the entrance, and once again we stood there, sullen, unreachable. Hangdog, our general resolve was not to give away. We were carried along by inertial force. The bosses only gave us new strength. The newly arrived breath had to say this. The administration of the Peshani camp requests the prisoners to take their food. The administration will receive any complaints. It will examine them and eliminate the causes of conflict between the administration and the prisoners. Had our ears deceived us? They were requesting us take food, and not so much as a word about work. We had stormed a camp jail, broken windows and lamps. We chased warders with knives, and now it turned out that far from being a mutiny, this was a conflict between the administration and the prisoners. It had taken only 2 days and 2 nights of unified action, and look at how our serf masters had changed their tone. Never in our lives, not only as prisoners, but as free men, as members of trade unions, had we heard our bosses speak with such unction. Nonetheless, we started silently dispersing. No one could take a decision there, nor could anyone there promise a decision. The foremen went away without once raising their eyes or looking around. even when the head of the separate campsite addressed us one after another by name. That was our answer. The hut was locked again. From outside, it looked to the bosses as dumb and unyielding as ever, but inside, sections were the scene of a stormy debate. The temptation was too great. Soft speech had affected the undemanding sex more than any threat would. Voices were heard urging surrender. What more, indeed, could we hope to achieve? We were tired, we were hungry. The mysterious force which had fused our emotions and borne us aloft was losing height, and with tremulous wings bringing us down to earth again. Yet mouths clamped tight for decades, mouths which had been silent for a lifetime and should have stayed silent for what was left of it, were now opened. Among those listening to them, of course, were the surviving stoolies. These exhortations and voices suddenly recovered for a few minutes, voices with a new ring to them. In our room, that of Dmitri Panin, we would have to be paid for by a fresh term of imprisonment, a noose around the throat in which the pulse of freedom had fluttered. It was a price worth paying, for the vocal cords were for the first time put to use, for which they were created. Give way now? That would mean accepting someone's word of honor. Whose word exactly? That of our jailers? The camp pack? The camp dog pack? In all the time the prisons had existed, in all the times the camps had been there, had they ever once kept their word? The sediment of ancient sufferings and wrongs and insults was stirred up anew. For the first time ever we had taken the right road. Were we to give in so soon? For the first time we had felt what it was like to be human, only to give in so quickly. A keen, a bracing breeze of mischief blew around us. We would go on. We would go on. We would go on. They'd sing a different tune before we finished. They would give way. But will we ever be able to believe anything they said? This was as unclear as ever. That is the fate of the oppressed. They are forced to believe and to yield. Once more, the emotions of 200 men were fused in a single passion. The wings of the eagle beat the air and sailed aloft. We lay down to conserve our strength, trying to move as little as possible and not talk unnecessarily. Our thoughts were quite enough to occupy us. The last crumbs in the hut had been finished long ago. No one had anything to cook or share in the general silence and stillness. The only sound was the voices of the young observers glued to the camp windows. They told us about all the comings and goings outside the camp. We admired these 20-year-olds, their enthusiasm undimmed by hunger, their determination to die on the threshold of life, with everything still before them, rather than surrender. We were envious of them, because the truth had entered our heads so late, and our spines were already setting in a servile arc. I can, I think, now mention the name Janet Baranovsky, Volodya Trofimov, and Bogdan, a metalworker. Suddenly, in the late afternoon of the third day, when the western sky was clearing and the sun was setting, and the setting sun could be seen, our observers shouted in anger and dismay, "Hut 9, 9 have surrendered. 9's going to the mess hall." We all jumped up. Prisoners from the other side of the corridor ran into our room, through the bars from the upper and lower bed platforms. Some of us on all fours, looking over other people's shoulders, we watched, transfixed, that sad procession. 250 pathetic little figures, darker than ever, against the sunset, cowed and crestfallen, were trailing slantwise across the camp. On they went, each of them glimpsed briefly in the rays of the setting sun. dawdling endless chain, as though those behind regretted that the foremost had set out and were loath to follow. Some, feebler than the rest, were led by the arm or the hand, and so uncertain were their steps that they looked like blind men with their guides. Many, too, held mess tins or mugs in their hands, and this mean prisonware carried an expectation of a supper too copious to gulp down on constricted stomachs. These tins and cups, held out like begging bowls, were more degrading and slavish and pitiable than anything else about them. I felt myself weeping. I glanced at my companions, and I wiped away my tears and saw there hut number 9 had spoken and decided for us all. It was there that the dead had been lying around for 4 days. Since Tuesday evening, they went into the mess hall, and it was as though they had decided to forgive the murderers in return for their bread ration and some mush. Hut number 9 was a hungry hut. The teams in it were all general laborers, and very few prisoners received parcels. There were many goners among them. Perhaps they had surrendered for fear that there would be other corpses. We went away from the windows without a word. It was then that I learned the meaning of Polish pride and understood their recklessly brave rebellions. The Polish engineer, Jerzy, whom I have mentioned before, was now in our team. He was serving his 9th and last year. Even when he was at work as signer, no one had ever heard him raise his voice. He was always quiet, polite, and gentle. But now his face was distorted with rage, scorn, and suffering, as he tore his eyes away from that procession of beggars and cried in an angry, steely voice, "Foreman, don't wake me for supper. I shan't be going." He clambered up to the top bunk, turned his face to the wall, and didn't get up again. That night we went to eat, but he wouldn't get up. He never received parcels. He was quite alone. He was always short of food, but he wouldn't get up. In his mind's eye, the steam from a bowl of mush could not veil the ideal of freedom. If we had all been so proud and so strong, what tyrant could have held out against us? Well, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening.